The candlelight flickers, restless against the draft of an old wooden chapel. On the altar, a veil trembles, white lace stitched for a woman, yet draped over the head of a child. Her hands are so small the wedding ring slips, sliding against. Skin not yet calloused by life, but already marked by fear. Outside, the night is still. Too still. No laughter, no celebration. Only the weight of whispers pressed into the dark. In the pews, neighbors watch with quiet approval, their faces carved into masks of tradition, obedience, and silence. They see a bride. But look closer, and you'll see a little girl clutching something hidden beneath the folds of her dress. A doll, its porcelain face cracked from play, staring blankly as if it knows what the living dare not admit. This is not the beginning of a love story. It is the burial of one. A child traded as though she were property, a life rewritten before it had the chance to begin. And soon, a secret will take root inside her, a secret she cannot possibly understand, one that will haunt her body, her family, and the generations that follow. What happens when innocence itself is forced into silence, and no one dares to call it by its name? Asterisk. The world Mercy Harrow was born into was a world of rigid expectations, unyielding silence, and the brutal arithmetic of survival. Hers was not the age of childhood as we know it today, no schoolyards filled with laughter, no protection under law, no concept of innocence shielded by society. In her time, childhood was fragile, fleeting, often extinguished before it had the chance to bloom. The year was the late 1800s. In a rural settlement marked by timber houses, candlelit chapels, and dirt roads that vanished into the dark woods. Life here was hard. Families were measured not by what they dreamed, but by what they endured. Survival was purchased through obedience, to faith, to family, to the unspoken codes that bound neighbors together in secrecy. A girl's future was never her own. From the moment she could walk, it was bargained, whispered, and sealed. Mercy was one of many children in a struggling household. Her father stern, devout, burdened by the pressure to uphold both reputation and survival, believed deeply in order. Her mother quiet, resigned, carried within her the weariness of a woman who had learned that questioning tradition came at too steep a cost. Between them, Mercy was raised not so much in warmth, but in the cold shadow of expectation, and yet there were glimpses of the child she truly was. She played in the fields with scraps of ribbon, sang to herself in the evenings when chores were done, and carried her beloved doll everywhere, a small token of softness in a world already sharpening its teeth against her. Neighbors described her as curious, gentle, sometimes shy, and sometimes bold in the way only a child can be before the weight of adulthood crushes it out. But childhood, in that place and time, was not viewed as a protected season. It was seen as a brief passage, a narrow hallway leading straight into labor, obedience, and service. For boys, that meant toil in the fields, learning to bear the whip of weather and work. For girls, it meant learning to bear something else entirely, the weight of marriage, the command of a husband, and the unspoken expectation of children. To us, it is unthinkable that a girl of 12 could be given away. But in Mercy's world, such transactions were cloaked in the language of piety and necessity. A girl's body was currency, her purity, her obedience, her fertility. Families who struggled could secure alliances through marriage, binding themselves to stronger neighbors, or to those who held influence in the church. And so, when whispers began that Mercy was of age, a phrase that meant little more than old enough to bleed, old enough to be wed, there were no gasps of horror. Only nods. Only silence. Still, the arrangement carried an unease that few dared to name. Some neighbors whispered that Mercy was far too small, her voice far too childlike, her hands still clumsy from play. Others silenced themselves, looking away, pressing their lips thin with the knowledge that questioning would mean exile from the church, from the town, from the fragile network of survival they depended on. And so, the wheels began to turn. A promise was made, a bargain sealed, and Mercy, barely more than a child, was dressed as though she were a woman. On the day of her wedding, those who looked upon her saw only the veil, not the child trembling beneath it. They saw only the preservation of tradition, not the annihilation of a life still unformed. But beneath the surface, the world was shifting. Modernity was creeping in. Newspapers in distant cities were beginning to publish stories about child labor, child brides, and the first movements for reform. Laws in some places were tightening, whispering of an age when children might finally be seen as children. Yet for Mercy, isolated in her small corner of the world, those reforms were a distant echo, too faint to reach her, too late to save. Her story, then, was not only the story of a girl, but of a culture unwilling to see her for what she was. A society that wrapped its cruelty in ritual, that disguised its violence in scripture and ceremony. And in that silence, Mercy was led forward, step by step, into a fate she could neither choose nor understand. She was only 12 years old. Asterisk. The timeline of Mercy Harrow's unraveling begins quietly, almost invisibly. At first it was spoken of in the hushed tone of routine, as though nothing unusual had happened, as though the union of a child and a grown man could be folded neatly into the rhythms of daily life. A marriage announced, a ceremony conducted, a girl transformed into a wife overnight. Neighbors recalled the days that followed in fragments. Mercy was seen walking beside her husband, her steps uneven, her body dwarfed by the bulk of his. Some claimed she smiled, that she carried herself with obedience, as though she understood the role now carved for her. But others whispered of the fear in her eyes, the way she clutched her doll tighter in those first weeks, as if refusing to surrender the last relic of her childhood. The records, sparse and brittle, suggest the union was consummated almost immediately. Mercy's life, once measured in games and chores, now turned into the silent ritual of obedience. She was no longer seen playing in the fields, no longer heard singing at dusk. Instead, there was an eerie stillness around her, a silence too heavy for someone so young. And then came the whispers of her body changing. Neighbors noted her pallor, her swelling frame, the fatigue that seemed to weigh her down. By the time she turned 12 and a half, the town spoke in quiet certainty. Mercy Harrow was with child. Here the timeline fractures. Some claimed the community celebrated, remarking that she had fulfilled her duty with remarkable speed. Others, more hushed, confessed unease, whispering that her small frame, her fragile body, was ill-suited for the burden she now carried. There are suggestions that her health declined rapidly, though no official doctor's notes survive, only scraps of oral testimony. And then, a darker inconsistency emerges. In some versions of the story, Mercy's pregnancy ended in tragedy, a stillbirth, or a child who lived only a few days. In others, no child is mentioned at all, only the sudden absence of Mercy herself. Did she die in childbirth, her young body unable to bear the weight? Or did she vanish under circumstances no one dared commit to paper? What is known for certain is that the records shift abruptly. Marriage registers that once bore her name grow silent. Census notes list her family, but omit her presence. In one parish ledger, her name appears, only to be struck through with heavy ink. And then, nothing. Asterisk. This silence is perhaps the loudest clue of all. In towns such as hers, where gossip was currency and memory was power, for a name to disappear so completely suggests not mere tragedy, but deliberate erasure. Someone wanted her story buried. Someone wanted her absence explained by nothing more than a gap in the paper. Yet the traces remain in rumor, in unease that bled through generations. Elderly villagers, when asked decades later, would avoid the question, eyes cast downward, as though the memory of Mercy carried a shadow still capable of staining the present. One woman recalled, in a broken whisper, "We were told not to speak of her, not to ask." Asterisk. But what had become of Mercy Harrow? A girl married at 12, pregnant almost immediately, yet her story dissolves into contradictions and absences. Some say she died in childbirth. Others that her child was taken, and she herself was sent away, hidden in shame. A few suggest something darker still, that the pregnancy was never brought to term, that what grew inside her body was silenced before its first breath. The deeper one looks, the more the mystery grows. Why were her records erased? Why do testimonies contradict so violently? And why does the story of a single child bride leave behind not clarity, but a hollow silence, as if the entire community conspired to press her into oblivion? This is the moment when Mercy Harrow's life passes from tragedy into legend. She becomes less a girl and more a haunting absence, a question mark carved into the bones of history. For some, her disappearance is explained by the cruelty of her time, the inevitability of a child forced into motherhood too soon. But for others, it feels more deliberate, as though her fate carried a secret too unbearable to be recorded. And so the mystery begins to take hold, not just of what happened to Mercy, but of why no one dared to preserve her truth. What was it that silenced an entire community and left behind only fragments of rumor, contradiction, and dread? What remains of Mercy Harrow's story lies scattered across fragile documents and brittle memories, as if her life were deliberately reduced to fragments too faint to piece together. And yet, in those scraps of evidence, a disturbing picture begins to emerge. The first trace lies in a parish ledger. Her name appears once, Mercy, married at 12 years, scrawled in cramped handwriting. But on the very next page, her name has been crossed out, a heavy stroke of ink cutting through her existence. No explanation. No note of death, no mention of departure, just erasure. It is as if someone wished not only to record her, but to then unrecord her, to pull her from history while leaving behind the faint scar of ink that proves she had been there at all. A midwife's notebook, recovered decades later in the belongings of a family descendant, hints at more. On a page listing births, one entry stands out: mother too young, frail, delivery perilous. The date coincides with the months following Mercy's wedding. There's no name of the mother, but the timing, the secrecy, the note of frailty. Scholars believe this may well have been Mercy, yet the record stops there. No outcome is written, no child is listed. Just silence where a life or two should be. Oral testimony adds another layer, though it muddies rather than clarifies. One elderly villager recalled seeing Mercy walking by the river late at night. Her figure hunched, her face pale, as though she were a ghost before death had claimed her. Another insisted she had been buried quietly, in unmarked ground. Her resting place denied the dignity of a headstone. Yet others contradicted this, claiming Mercy lived on, hidden away, her child taken from her arms by those who considered her unfit to mother. Psychologists who study the trauma of child brides offer chilling insight. A girl of 12, forced into pregnancy, would face not only unbearable physical risks, but profound psychological rupture. Her mind, still forming, would have been caught between childhood instincts and the brutal demands of adult expectation. Experts describe this as a fracture of self, a splitting of identity where the child retreats inward, while the imposed role of wife takes over externally. Symptoms include silence, withdrawal, even the appearance of ghost-like detachment, the very qualities Mercy's neighbors described, but the documents and theories only raise more contradictions. If Mercy died in childbirth, why was there no record of burial? If she lived, where did she go? Why was her name deliberately blotted from the parish register? And why, above all, did those who knew her remain so careful not to speak? Some historians suggest the silence was pragmatic. Child marriage, though cruel, was not unheard of, and communities often closed ranks to protect themselves from outside judgment. If Mercy's case ended in tragedy, recording it might have invited scrutiny, shame, even legal repercussions. Better to erase her than to risk exposure. Yet others believe something darker was at play. Among the surviving oral fragments is a curious, unsettling detail. Several villagers, interviewed separately, claimed that Mercy's child, if indeed it was born, was unnatural. They described its features as distorted, its cry as not like other babies. Was this simply the cruel gossip of a superstitious community, or does it hint at an unspoken horror? The contradictions build like a storm. A girl too young to be a wife, erased from records yet remembered in whispers. A birth recorded only in suggestion, its outcome cloaked in silence. A disappearance that feels less like chance and more like design. And through it all, Mercy's presence lingers. Not in full portraits or clear testimonies, but in the very absences, the missing records, the silences in interviews, the inked-out name. As though she were both there and not there, a haunting caught between fact and erasure. What we are left with is not clarity, but dissonance. A ledger that says she existed, a notebook that says she gave birth, villagers who say she died, and others who say she lived. Whispers of shame, whispers of something worse. Mercy Harrow's story is a puzzle with too many missing pieces. And yet, in those jagged gaps, we feel the truth pressing against us. A truth too raw, too dangerous, to have been spoken in her time. And perhaps that is why the silence endures. Because what happened to Mercy was not merely the tragedy of one child, it was the crime of an entire community. And crimes that implicate everyone have a way of dissolving into shadows, leaving behind only questions sharp enough to wound. To understand the impact of what happened to Mercy Harrow, one must step inside the silence that surrounded her. Silence was not simply the absence of words, it was an atmosphere, a suffocating weight that pressed upon her until it shaped every breath, every thought, every fragment of her existence. For Mercy herself, the transformation was devastating. At 12 years old, she was still forming her sense of self. Her mind was in the fragile space between imagination and identity, still clinging to childish comforts, yet just beginning to glimpse the broader world. And into that unfinished mind, a brutal contradiction was forced. One moment she was a child, clutching her doll with trembling fingers. The next she was expected to become a wife, a mother, a bearer of duties she could neither understand nor consent to. Psychologists call this developmental fracture, the shattering of childhood identity before it can fully cohere. It manifests in withdrawal, silence, the blank, haunted gaze described in the testimonies of those who once saw her. It is the mind's attempt to survive what the body cannot, retreating inward, splitting itself off, locking away the child that still wanted to laugh and play. And then there was her pregnancy. For a girl so young, the physical toll alone was catastrophic. The human body at 12 is not built to sustain childbirth, and the strain often results in long-term injuries, infections, or death. But beyond biology lay the deeper terror. Mercy's womb became a battleground where childhood and womanhood collided, where her own innocence was forced to carry a weight it was never meant to bear. One can imagine the confusion, the fear of her body changing in ways she could not comprehend, the terror of carrying life when she herself had barely begun to live. Those around her bore their own psychological scars, though they expressed them differently. Her parents, bound by faith and community, may have told themselves they were doing what was necessary, securing her future, preserving their reputation, obeying the dictates of tradition. Yet witnesses describe her mother as distant, her gaze heavy with unspoken sorrow. Was it guilt, resignation, or the kind of numbness that comes when a person cannot afford to feel what they truly feel? Mercy's father, by contrast, seemed rigid, insisting on silence. Perhaps he believed his decision righteous. Perhaps he buried his doubt under authority. But doubt has a way of festering in the dark, turning certainty into fear. The community, too, became complicit in its own silence. Every neighbor who looked away, every villager who refused to ask questions, carried a fragment of the burden. Over time, that collective guilt became something almost spectral, an unease that haunted their children, and their children's children. Decades later, descendants would speak of Mercy's story as a shadow they were told never to name, a secret that lingered in their families like a curse. And yet, it is the psychological toll on Mercy herself that cuts deepest. Imagine the nights she spent in solitude, listening to the murmurs of adults who spoke around her, but never to her. Imagine the loneliness of being trapped between two worlds, too young to be called a woman, no longer allowed to be a child. In her silence, she must have wrestled with questions that had no answers. Why me? Why now? What did I do to deserve this? For those who study trauma, these questions are as dangerous as the suffering itself. They create wounds that do not heal, that echo through generations. In some communities, stories like Mercy's become unspoken lessons, warnings carried in silence. Girls grow up sensing the weight of something unsaid, a fear pressed into them not through words, but through atmosphere. The trauma lingers, not as history, but as inheritance. And there is a spiritual dimension too. To strip a child of her innocence under the guise of ritual, to bind her in vows she cannot comprehend, this is more than cruelty. It is the twisting of sacred into profane, the inversion of love into violence. For some, Mercy's story is not only a tragedy, but a desecration, a wound upon the soul of the community itself. What remains then is grief. Not the kind that finds release in mourning, but a grief trapped in silence, festering in guilt and fear, a grief that poisons the living because it was never allowed to be named for what it truly was. And perhaps that is why Mercy's name still lingers in whispers. Not because she lived long enough to leave a mark, but because her silence was so complete, so crushing, that it left behind a void. A void that generations have been forced to stare into, knowing it was carved not by fate, but by human hands. When we look back at Mercy Harrow's short, fractured life, the absence of clarity demands explanation. How could a child be married, become pregnant, then vanish from records almost entirely? Why would an entire community choose silence over truth? Across decades of research, 3 major theories have emerged. Each offers an answer, yet each leaves behind new shadows. The first is the most pragmatic, that Mercy's marriage was a desperate economic transaction. Families in rural settlements often saw daughters as bargaining chips, their marriages securing financial support, land, or alliances. By marrying Mercy off at 12, her parents may have believed they were ensuring her survival. When her pregnancy ended, whether in tragedy during childbirth or in the death of her infant, her disappearance from records could have been a form of erasure. To admit such a death would invite scrutiny, shame, even legal consequences as attitudes toward child. Marriage slowly began to shift. Erasure, then, becomes a form of damage control. A girl's life sacrificed twice, first in marriage, then in memory. But others argue this explanation is far too neat. That brings us to the second theory, one that points to deliberate cover-up. Some scholars believe Mercy's story hides the actions of men in power, men whose reputations required protection. Her husband, depending on which records you believe, may have held influence in the church or community. If Mercy died during childbirth, questions might have been raised about the morality and legality of marrying children so young. If she lived, but her child was malformed, stillborn, or illegitimate in some way, the scandal could have destabilized local authority. In this reading, the blotting out of her name from parish records was not a clerical accident, but a deliberate strike of the pen, an act of concealment. Supporting this theory are the fragmented testimonies collected decades later. Multiple villagers, interviewed separately, recalled being told as children never to speak of Mercy. One elderly woman admitted that her parents referred to Mercy's fate as a stain that must be forgotten. Such language suggests not only tragedy but shame, a collective pact of silence meant to protect more than just one family. Was Mercy's silence to protect her community from outside condemnation? Or was she erased to protect the powerful from exposure? The third theory veers away from the pragmatic and into the folkloric. Among the most disturbing fragments are those describing Mercy's child, or what little was said of it. A few whispers suggest that the baby, if it was born, was not right, that its cry was unsettling, that its body bore marks. Whether this reflects the cruel superstition of a community faced with a premature or malformed birth, or something darker still, is impossible to say. But in rural communities, steeped in superstition, such births were often read as curses, punishments, or omens. Some speculate that Mercy's fate became shrouded in legend precisely because her story became interwoven with fear of a curse, fear of divine wrath, fear of bloodlines marked by tragedy. Over time, these whispers may have distorted her memory, transforming a human tragedy into a haunting myth. Of course, skeptics dismiss this supernatural coloring as nothing more than the distortion of oral history. Memories rot, and fear fills the gaps. But whether curse or coincidence, the folklore surrounding Mercy is itself evidence of how deeply her absence unsettled those who lived in its shadow. The investigations that followed, however, were incomplete at best. Local authorities recorded nothing beyond her marriage. Regional records yield only the faintest echo-scribbled notes, half-legible names, the occasional census that omits her entirely. Attempts to trace her descendants falter, for if she bore a living child, it either did not survive, or was absorbed silently into another household. Even modern researchers have struggled. Archives are missing pages. Documents show suspicious ink stains. Whole sections appear destroyed by time or perhaps by intent. In the end, no theory explains everything. If her story was economic, why the deliberate silence? If it was a cover-up, who enforced it, and why so completely? And if folklore holds any truth, why did her memory take root so stubbornly in whispers, even when official records tried to erase her? What we are left with is not a resolution, but a deepening unease. Mercy Harrow's story cannot be explained by evidence alone, because evidence itself has been sabotaged. It has been buried, contradicted, stained. Every theory offers an answer, yet none quiet the silence that lingers. Perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all, that the mystery surrounding Mercy is not the byproduct of history's decay, but the deliberate work of those who wanted her forgotten. And in their silence, in their fear, they gave her something they never intended: immortality. The story of Mercy Harrow ends not with a record, not with a grave, not even with certainty, but with silence. And perhaps that is why it still haunts U.S. Silence has a way of surviving where words do not. Silence grows roots. It passes through generations like a shadow, whispering in the pauses between sentences, in the pages left blank in old ledgers, in the names struck through with ink. When we speak of Mercy, we are not speaking only of a girl from another century. We are speaking of something larger, more unsettling, the ease with which innocence can be rewritten, traded, or erased. Mercy's veil was not only a garment placed on her head. It was a shroud for her childhood, for her freedom, and perhaps for her very existence. The tragedy of Mercy Harrow is not merely that she was wed too young, or that her body was forced to bear the unbearable. The deeper horror is that she was swallowed by silence, consumed by the complicity of those who should have spoken. Her parents, her neighbors, her community, even the officials who penned her name only to strike it out, all of them contributed to the erasure. In the end, Mercy was not just a victim of circumstance. She was a victim of forgetting, but forgetting is never clean. It leaves behind stains. It is said that descendants of her village carried a quiet dread, an unease they could not quite name. Children were warned not to wander near the chapel where Mercy once stood. Her name, though forbidden, still found its way into whispered tales, told at night when the lamps burned low. Some swore that the sound of crying could be heard by the river where she had once been seen, a cry too soft, too broken to belong to the living. Whether these are legends or echoes of conscience hardly matters. They exist because Mercy was never given the dignity of truth, and this is why her story matters. Because Mercy Harrow is not an isolated figure, she is a mirror. In her, we see the dangerous pattern of how societies sacrifice their most vulnerable. In the name of tradition, obedience, survival. We see how silence becomes an accomplice to violence. We see how easily a child can vanish, not only from life, but from history itself. Her name might have been lost completely had it not been for the ink blot that betrayed its erasure, the fragment of a midwife's note, the handful of whispers that refused to die. It makes one wonder, how many other mercies have been buried without even that trace? How many children's lives have been consumed by rituals meant to sanctify suffering, their stories dissolved in silence, so complete it leaves no echo? Perhaps that is what unsettles us most, that Mercy Harrow's fate is not simply the relic of a brutal past. Her story reminds us that innocence, even now, is fragile, that the vulnerable can be erased quietly, without protest, while the world looks away. Her haunting is not just local, not just historical, it is universal. A warning that what happened once can happen again. So long as silence outweighs courage, so we are left with the image of a child dressed as a bride, her small hands hidden in lace, her doll pressed secretly beneath the folds of her gown. We are left with a name, struck through in ink, still faintly visible beneath the scar of erasure. We are left with questions that will never be answered. Did she die in childbirth? Did she live, hidden away in shame? Was her child taken, or did it never draw breath? Or was her silence manufactured so completely that the truth was buried along with her? No record can tell us, no testimony agrees. All we have is silence, and silence can never satisfy. And so Mercy Harrow lingers, not as a figure of history, but as a ghost of conscience. Her story is the story of what happens when innocence is betrayed, when silence is chosen over truth, when memory is erased yet refuses to stay buried. The final question is not what happened to Mercy. The final question is what her story demands of us. If a child can be wed, pregnant, erased, and almost forgotten, then what does that say about us? About the shadows we allow to remain unspoken? About the lives still hidden in silence today? And perhaps the most chilling thought of all, if Mercy's voice could be smothered so easily, how many more voices are we still not hearing?